Today we have a special guest, Anita Govender, who is a coach and transformational coach with a company called Beliefs 180. So, Anita, without trying to overjump you on you doing your background, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and a little bit about your business?
Hi, Carolyn. Thanks so much for having me. So, yes, as you mentioned, I'm a transformational coach, which is a little bit different than a life coach because I go more into the healing side of things. So, yeah, my journey on this started more than, 10 years ago when I got into the work of energy healing. And I was really enjoying that. I was doing hands-on healing. And my clients would come in and sit down and chat for like an hour without even getting on the table. And I
Mm.
found every client was doing this after a while. And I thought, initially I just wanted like maybe 10 minutes, tell me what's happening, and then we can go and sort of work on the problem. And this kept happening. And I felt like, okay, what's going on? I need to look at this and reassess. And basically, I kind of stepped out of that world and went into a whole host, just studying what I needed to in order to be able to be of better service. And that's how I ended up doing transformational coaching because um, I found that that way I could help them more on the healing side without doing the hands-on healing, if you would, and giving them techniques really for coping with what was or for dealing with what was going on in their lives. And so that's what led me on this path. And I'm just super excited about it because I get to see the transformation happen as I work with someone. So that's pretty awesome. And yeah, and so still incorporating aspects of the healing. So my type of coaching is kind of like a hybrid of healing as well as um, some coaching aspects as well.
Well, I ran into you because I registered for a virtual summit on addiction and recovery, and I was really fascinated with some of the work that you were doing. But today's conversation is all about a really specific topic, and this is all about adverse childhood experiences and how those experiences impact people that are attempting to recover from the disease of addiction and stay in recovery, and how not dealing with things that have happened in the past might make it much more difficult to achieve what you want. So now that I've said this, adverse childhood experiences, sometimes people call them an ACE for short. Why don't you explain to the listeners what an adverse childhood experience is? What's the obvious types of experiences and maybe what's not so obvious?
So these experiences are typically, it's different for every person because each person reacts to experiences differently. What you might look at something and be like, that's nothing, someone else takes very personally and it has a different effect on them. So an adverse childhood experience could be anything from any kind of abuse, the simplest way that I can put this is any experience that caused you to feel the ouch. You were hurt in some
Not
way.
only the ouch, but the big ouch.
The big ouch.
Yeah.
Yes. Whether that's emotionally, whether that's physically, emotionally, all three, that's pretty much what it is. Because when you feel the pain of it, the sting of it, the ouch of it, it has an impact on you. Because in that experience, whether you do this consciously or not, and most of the time, it is unconscious. When you have an experience like that, you form a belief about yourself and about the way the world around you works. You assess what your safety is and what isn't. So even if you think, I don't ever think about that experience, that happened when I was 4. I don't ever think about that. It is still affecting you today if you haven't dealt with it. whether you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, it doesn't matter. It still affects you today. So that's what those experiences are. And they have far-reaching effects.
Yeah, and I think some of them are pretty obvious. So, for example, you mentioned abuse. Another one might be the death of somebody close to you in your family.
Absolutely.
Could be a divorce. The abuse could be emotional, it could be physical. But there's also some big ouches that are not quite so obvious to people. So, in my own personal experience with my daughter Laura, she had several what a normal person would think of, that's no big deal, but to her it was a big ouch. So big ouch number one was she changed sports. She was identified with one group, and now that was her social community. Now she's with another one. Another big ouch was a physical move out of a neighborhood she'd known for her whole life, and now she's into a much bigger neighborhood and starting high school. Another big ouch for her was the fact that I remarried, and now that the attention wasn't always on her. So what are some other um, less obvious things that most people would like brush them off or move past them, but they end up being the big ouch or the adverse experience for someone? Let's help our audience kind of like maybe tick down a list of some other things.
So, not having the attention that you needed as a child, does have an effect on some people where they could see that as abandonment or neglect. So when they don't get, their needs met at that young age, and this could teach them how to, want to be super independent and withdraw and put a shawl around them. There's also, bullying is a huge thing as well, because that affects kids in such a vast way today, mentally, emotionally. I mean, we hear about the suicides of teens because of bullying and that kind of thing. And even if it's not done in person and it's just, it's the cyberbullying, that has a tremendous effect on someone as well. There's also, things like when someone, just lovingly might say something and they have no idea the impact of what they're saying. Like, we talk about these things like having an aunt or someone that comes up here, oh, look at you, you're such a chubby little kid. Well, they use the word chubby, and so
Yeah.
they don't think anything about it. But to the child, that could have such devastating effects on their self-image and their body image. So it's little things like that, and that's why it's kind of it's sort of so elusive, because it's not a standard set that of rules that applies to everybody. People take things differently, so
Yes.
those could be some of the benign things.
Yeah. So I agree with you. Like, I've never even in my own mind realized what an impact that had on my daughter. But years later, as she was in and out of treatment for addiction, those things came out. So knowing that you're going to be speaking and conducting a session at this virtual summit based on addiction and recovery, let's talk about why an unresolved adverse childhood experience really hampers your ability to have a successful recovery. What's going on that makes that important and difficult and important to resolve and overcome?
Okay, so a lot of people, we've heard this over a million times in our lives. Just get over it. Something happens, like, just get over it. And sometimes when we think that because we don't think about something, that we're over it, it doesn't affect us anymore. This is so not true, because here's what happens when we have an experience that really has an adverse effect on us, right? So when the actual experience happens and you feel the pain and the hurt of that, and you don't process that, and almost none of us process our emotions because we were not taught how to do it, but we do stuff it. We do try to distract. We try to not feel the pain of what we are feeling. So what happens then? That has to go somewhere. So we tuck it somewhere in our bodies. It's held there. And then, of course, at the level of mind, we don't think about it. But then you have another experience where someone else says something, and now you get triggered, where you're reacting emotionally to something somebody said to you in the moment. And you don't realize it actually came from the previous experience that you've had. And this could be decades. Typically, it shows up in marriages because the partner that we choose holds up a mirror to all the stuff that we have held inside of us. And we think it's about the topic in the moment, but it isn't. It goes back to the experiences we've had when we were younger. And so what happens is the emotion comes up, and we are so identified with our thoughts and emotions, there's no separation between them, that we believe what we feel is who we are. And that is so not the case. So what happens is you have someone say something to you, it triggers something within you. You feel the emotions come up, you have no skills to deal with it. And so what happens is you turn to other substances to numb it, to dull it, to avoid it, to distract from it. And so this, let's just say somebody, and we'll go to the extreme cases with abuse, for instance. So somebody was abused and they don't want to deal with that pain. Today, someone says something that brings up that pain, but they don't want to think about it. They don't want to go there. And they don't even make the correlation between I'm feeling this now because of what happened when I was 5. So they don't make that connection. So they think it's completely unrelated. But this is what causes people to, when you don't resolve those issues, they still have an emotional impact on you every day. They drive all the decisions that you make because that's the space you are reacting from. The part of you that experienced the trauma, no matter what age, is still stuck in the trauma. That part of you that experienced the trauma is still stuck in the trauma, and therefore continues to react from that traumatic space. Even though you, as the adult today, want a different idea for your life, you want to move in a different direction, you want to think and be differently, this still controls you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it answers the question, but it also brings up another one, because it seems to me that what you're describing are traumatic and adverse events that people are not cognizant of. So in other words, they're reacting to something in the moment. They're not cognizant that this roots back to something that happened in their childhood. How do people become self-aware that these two things are connected? Like, how do they dig up or uncover what's happened to them in the past, and then figure out, oh yeah, this is what I'm reacting to because this was part of my childhood or part of my past?
So that's why, personal development is so huge today, because people are going in and doing more of the introspective work. It takes a lot of courage and bravery to have to sit down and look at one's life. But more than just the experience happening and feeling the emotions of it, tied with it are all the negative and the limiting beliefs or self-defeating beliefs that they made up about themselves that's tied to the experience. So all the feelings of I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I don't deserve to have a good life, those kinds of things, and so many more are tied up with the experiences that we've had. So working with someone to actually uncover, okay, you had this experience, these are the beliefs you made up about yourself regarding those experiences. And once you reconcile those experiences, those parts of you that are still trapped in the trauma, once you bring those parts of you into safety, I use a process called reconcile and resolve, and you bring those into safety and they've calmed down, then you can start moving forward. But it takes a lot of courage. It's looking within to see, this is what affected me, and here's why I do the things I do to cope with what happened.
So one thing I know about relapse is that it often happens when there's a trigger present. So for
Yes.
example, the trigger might be, gosh, I'm around the community of people that I used to use with. It might be something that happened to them that in the moment that creates stress. So they're attempting to manage their stress. So are you basically saying that these adverse experiences are also a trigger, but they're just unrecognized?
Very much so. Very much so, because when we're triggered, we feel the emotion, the anger, the sadness, just whatever. And the trigger, that you've been triggered when someone says or does something, you feel the pain of it and you take it personally. You take it as if they are saying it to you about you, and that's who you are. And it's not. So that's the first clue, is that when you take something personally, you know that it's speaking to a hurt, unhealed part of you.
So oftentimes, not just oftentimes, most of the time, someone that is addicted and attempting to manage recovery also exists in a family unit, right?
Yes.
So, so if so, wouldn't it be pretty difficult if the person that's in recovery is a son or daughter and the adverse experience happened, as they grew up with mom and dad, for mom and dad uh, to try and help bring that out, like to help understand, well, gosh, this happened as I was raising my child. Now that I'm a little more educated and I'm past that, I can bring that out. So in your work with people that are attempting to understand these adverse experience and try to get over them, how important is it for the family unit to really acknowledge, yes, this is what happened in the past. This is what helped create the adverse experience.
It is actually quite critical, especially when you have a family member that has turned to substance abuse in order to cope with what they are dealing with, which would tell you the gravity of what that, though, maybe one experience, maybe many experiences, what effect that has on them, that they have to take these drastic measures in order to not feel the pain of it. So that right there is a clue, like, okay, I think the thing to remember also, Carolyn, is it's not about judgment. That doesn't make anyone a bad parent. It doesn't mean that they failed. But taking the responsibility for, okay, I didn't know better.
Right.
I really, when I said or did certain things, I did not know that it was affecting you in this way. And so that's a huge step in someone feeling heard and validated. When you can look at yourself and say, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I did not realize this is how it impacted you. And then moving into a space of, well, now I need to grow and learn from that. If my actions in this way caused this kind of pain in my kid, I need to look at, healing myself as well, because there will be pain from that. Because no parent wants to say, oh, I did this and then that caused my kid to go down this path. So it's really important for the family to also be able to recognize this, because it's not just an isolated thing that this child decided to walk down the path of addiction just because they was the only problem, so to speak. So it's very important.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think for me, it was a little bit different in the respect that I'm not wired that way. So in other words, I can get past things pretty quickly and easily. So I failed to recognize when my child couldn't do that. Like, you know, to me, going to a new school, new neighborhood was exciting. And so I never even recognized that it would be different and have an impact on her. The other thing you also said was that oftentimes this happens in a situation with a couple, you know, when you get married or with a partner or spouse. So if I am a partner or spouse and all of a sudden, you know, my significant other is reacting in a way that I don't expect, what can I do as a partner and spouse to really help that individual that's having that triggered event um, understand it or recognize that that's a problem? How should the spouse react?
So I would say wait until they cool down completely,
Good point.
like completely. And even if it means like the next day, you first have to set your intention as the spouse as to what it is that you want to accomplish. That is critical because it's not about you wanting to go in there and be right. That is just not going to solve anything. It's not about I'm right and you're wrong. But if you genuinely want to understand, it's having that heart to heart conversation, really listening. And listening is not thinking about what your response is going to be to what they're saying, because that's not really listening to them. That's hearing the words and formulating your response. That's not going to help. Really listening from the heart is not thinking about what your response is, but hearing every word they're saying and why it matters. So you would ask, I understand how upset you got yesterday when this happened, but I feel there's something deeper than that. Tell me, when I said this to you, what about what I said made you feel so angry? And start a conversation, and typically we know about our spouses, childhood and those kinds of things, because obviously those are conversations we've had. So we have ideas about what may have happened. And it's a gentle asking, like, did this remind you or make you feel the same way as when you went through this experience, or as a means of understanding, right? As just a means of understanding where they're coming from. And in doing that, just being heard makes such a huge difference to somebody. And they may not even, your spouse may not even realize, like, oh, yeah, I got angry at you, but actually, I'm really angry from that thing that happened, and that could help with that understanding and bridge that gap there for them as well. But again, it's about having compassion, it's about having empathy, and it's about absolute non-judgment. That's critical.
So when you're working with someone in your coaching practice that's attempting to get past these experiences so that they can have a more meaningful recovery, this is maybe kind of like how I think about things, but I think about it things in process. Step one, recognize there's, that
Awareness.
there's a problem, right? Gain awareness. So what are some of the steps that you take people through so that they can recognize and resolve and move forward?
So when we bring the awareness to them, so the work that I do has a lot to do with the self-defeating beliefs that people have about themselves. And so it's centered around that. So when we talk about the experiences that they've had, we also look at the beliefs that they formed about themselves from those experiences. And the reconcile and resolve process is actually taking them through this process where when they reconcile that part of them, what that actually means really is the emotional pain that they feel when they think about an experience they've had, we completely desensitize that emotion completely. So when they think about the experience, they just list it as, yes, that's a fact that happened to me. But that emotional hurt and pain is totally neutralized. So that's when they know, okay, they've healed from that. They don't feel the pain of that anymore. So now, if you're not feeling the pain of something that happened, you're less likely to get triggered surrounding that experience when someone else talks to you about something, right? So if you're not triggered, you're not going to react. And
Well, it seems to me that what you're doing is, when you deal with somebody that's recovering from addiction, there's a list of triggers that are obvious. I don't want to be in the same place with people that I bought drugs from. I don't want to. So
correct.
this is on the list of triggers. And so you're basically eliminating triggers that would cause them to want to tamp down that pain, right?
That is correct. That is absolutely correct. To give you an example, a real life example of this, um, I did a session with someone who, when she was around 11 years or so, she was almost kidnapped. And she escaped, but that was a traumatic experience. Her family did not actually want to admit that that's what happened. So they never really validated her or spoke to her or even had her, get any help for the trauma that she experienced. So she lived with this the whole time. So of course you couldn't just come up behind her and, like tap her or whatever, because that would,
Yeah.
freak her out. And she said when she speaks about, even when she was relating the story to me, she was in such emotional distress. She was crying so much as if it just happened like the week before. That's how fresh these things are when we go back to them. And when I was speaking to her, she was in her 30s, right? And so I did the reconcile and resolve session on her and spoke with her maybe a week or so later. And one of the things she said was that she was explaining to a friend what our session was about. And she realized it was the first time in her life that she spoke about that instance and never shed a tear. Never shed a tear. She just like it was gone. Now, that happened. That was an experience she remembers, but there's no emotional attachment to that anymore, which means she's not re traumatizing herself every time she thinks about it. She's not in pain over it. She can move past it.
Yeah, and I see so many people in different groups that I belong to in Facebook when they're talking about, the person that's struggling with addiction or they're struggling with addiction, they're re-traumatizing themselves when they tell the story. And so I think that's important to be able to tell the story and not feel the pain when you experience it. So as we come to the end of our 30 minutes, what advice would you give to someone that is attempting but struggling to stay in recovery relative to these adverse experiences, or the person that's supporting that individual? What would be a good piece of advice that they can walk away from this conversation with?
The biggest thing that I can say is the healing of it really takes precedence over anything else. And it's more than just telling your story. It's more than just talking about it. It's actually healing the experience. Because, what I attempt to do with the people that I work with, I don't want them to have coping mechanisms, because that means you got to know how to cope in the moment it's happening. What I'm attempting to do with people is give them techniques that they can use to move through new triggers that come through and neutralizing the old ones. So it's not coping, but it's actually working through them. And the healing is the most important part. So, in as much as we don't want to look at and don't even like to think about the fact that our past still runs our present, we have to get real to that fact. We really do. It doesn't matter whether you don't think about it or not, it is still happening.
Well, so this has been a fascinating conversation, and just so all of you will know that we've recorded it and it will be live on Pathroot. So if you have watched this and you see someone else that you think ought to hear it, make sure you send them back to the page, same page that you attended the live stream. So Anita, thank you so much. We'll make sure that on the system, we have a way for people to get in touch with you. And I'm looking forward to the virtual summit and your sessions there. So thank you again.
Thank you, Carolyn. Really appreciate you having me on.